from Georgetown University, who is speaking to us about ambivalent borders, why we love to hate our zombies. Catherine.
Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I think this has been the best conference I've been to in years. Learned a whole lot in the last couple of days, and I've tried to incorporate some of that here. I do want to start with a little quotation from Adam Phillips, who's right now I'm a bit obsessed with Adam Phillips. And the quote is, "There is something unmanageable about being a person." All right, which seems like a theme here. Let's see, I'm not used to this. Okay. So I'm not going to distract you with that. So first, I have a few caveats about the paper. It's focused on the US, which seems incredibly narrow and limited to me after being at this conference for a couple of days. But that is what we have here. And secondly, I'm really focusing on disgust and desire. There's lots of other emotions around zombies, but that is my focus for this paper. These are two emotions that, when directed to the same object, come into conflict with each other. And that's what I'm interested in, that kind of ambivalence. I also want to start by defining what I mean by emotion when I talk about emotion. And I recognize there's so many debates about the meaning of the word across psychology, philosophy, history of emotion. But the way I think about it is there are a lot of affects out there. There's a lot of moods, there's feelings everywhere, most of them in here. But an emotion is a cultural, social sort of thing. It emerges when some mixture of these moods and feelings and sort of affects that are floating around solidifies into something the culture recognizes as a particular defined state of mind. So Katie talked the other day about neo-emotions, right? And that really spoke to my work on ambivalence. And that's because despite Hamlet's to be or not to be and all of the other examples we can come up with, we did not have a word for binary internal conflict until early in the 20th century, 1910 to be exact. There's probably no greater example of an invented emotion than this one, okay? In November 1910, Eugen Bleuler, who was a Swiss psychiatrist, coined the word ambivalence in a public lecture, and he transformed what had been this undefined feeling state into a culturally recognizable emotion. To equally and emphatically desire two different and incompatible objects would, from that time on, be termed ambivalence. So let me just show you a few. There's the hospital that Bleuler managed. He didn't own it, but he used it to house women in particular who were having emotional and mental difficulties. Here's his textbook, and the little part that's highlighted there is the word ambivalence, and that's where one of the places he discusses it. So in this lecture where he defined it for the first time, he started with several vignettes involving women who were ambivalent about their confinement in his treatment facility. They didn't know if they wanted to stay or they wanted to go. But his most dramatic example was that of, quote, "the mother who killed her child and is now laughing with her mouth in spite of her desperation." And in another translation, it's she's killed her child and is now laughing with her mouth and can't stop laughing. She, he asserts, is experiencing, quote, "two conflicting but unrelated coexisting feelings. She is ambivalent." Bleuler viewed ambivalence as one of the 4 or 5 symptoms, depending on what stage of his career he was at, that typified schizophrenia. Another word that he also invented, and Freud complained that Bleuler tended to invent too many words. The other symptoms, if you're interested, were autism, by which he meant self-involvement, affect, by which he meant inappropriate emotional expression, and association, illogical or chaotic associations. And they call that the 4 A's. Freud and other prominent psychiatrists quickly picked up the term, and unlike I think Freud used it like the following, within 6 months. And it eventually spread through the Western world, divorced from, but still shadowed by its psychiatric, carceral, and gendered context. While for many years it was viewed as the mark of a weak, effeminate psyche, partly because Buhler associated it with women and with schizophrenia, partly because masculinity was constructed in terms of an authoritative certainty, it has recently been rehabilitated, and I could talk for 40 minutes about the rehabilitation of the word. As Zygmunt Bauman has famously argued, an articulated and marked ambivalence seems to have evolved with the rise of the new certainties of modernity, modern law, psychiatry, and social theory. These fields assert an internal autonomy resulting in firm decisions meant to valorize what we might call a feeling of certainty or their own authority. In response to modernity's constraints, ambivalence operated as a form of resistance to the state, but also to categorization and reductionism. Okay, so with that in mind, the question for me becomes not so much, do we feel ambivalent or do they feel ambivalent and when, as how to recognize ambivalence when we see it and how the objects of these ambivalent feelings changed over time. What does that tell us about our historical moment? I think another related question, which I'm not going to address today, is the evolution of the use of the word, so that today often people just say, I feel confused, I feel ambivalent, right? But that was not the original technical meaning. So we're ambivalent about many things, right? Our mothers, our partners, people we know, jobs, countries, ideas, and loyalties. Freud thought that every strong attachment was an ambivalent attachment. Okay. But we're not here so much for ambivalence, it's for the zombies, right? So I just want to say a little about what spurred my inquiry here. Zombies are disgusting, right? They smell bad, they have open wounds and decaying flesh, and they're cannibalistic feeders on other humans. And these are all features that would ordinarily cause a biologically grounded disgust reaction in humans, right? And yet the success of the zombie film series, of TV series and the game industry tells us that zombies are very popular indeed. For instance, the zombie game, which I had never heard of, and I don't, raise your hand if you've heard of this, Plants versus Zombies, that's the name of the game, has sold over 30 million, you have heard of it? Oh, one person heard of it. Sold, have you played it? Oh, okay, good. Has sold over 30 million copies, and that represents a mere sliver of the consumer market. Okay, here is some wallpaper you can buy if you're so inclined. Right, and that's, I mean, the zombie merchandise is everywhere on top of all of the cultural productions. The popularity of an object that generally evokes disgust strikes me as odd, as a sort of symptom that needs unpacking. To cite Adam Phillips channeling Freud, a symptom is a secret way, I have a slide on that. A symptom is a secret way of asking for something forbidden, right? What is it that the culture is asking for? What do we desire in this zombie popularity? Given that zombies themselves are not ambivalent about anything, they are completely intent on eating brains and ripping humans apart, how have they evoked such marked ambivalence? Part of my argument is that they embody ambivalence and that they exist in a state between life and death, human and inhuman, the past, which will not stay past and stay dead and buried, and the end of time. If they had desires, those desires would be ambivalent. Our response to this display of radical ambivalence makes the zombie a site of both attraction and revulsion, but also an arena in which to work out various cultural, political, and social issues. Ambivalence in this context takes on an epistemic role as we try to solve whatever immediate and pressing cultural, political issue is showing up: racism, imperialism, consumerism, divisiveness. But our interest in zombies also signifies a sort of love, if we imagine love as the act of paying attention. We are attentive to zombies, and not merely out of fear, we are interested in them in ways not easily explained. And of course, many fans identify with violence, and the recent invention of rage zombies and alpha zombies is chilling, given what's happening in the US, and I'll bracket that for now. David Hume had one response to this question in his 1757 essay of tragedy. I'll paraphrase. The more we are touched and affected, the more we are delighted with the spectacle. And as soon as the uneasy passions cease to operate, the piece, meaning the usually theater, is at an end, no matter what the passion is. Let it be disagreeable, afflicting, melancholy, disordered. It is still better than that insipid languor which arises from perfect tranquility. In other words, we would rather be disgusted or scared than bored. Hume would have found it hard to imagine the images we are currently exposed to. He thought one of the plays that he references, and Laura might know which one this is, someone bangs somebody's head against the wall and there's blood. Hume thought that was going too far. Okay. And his theory, because it's so generalized, does not really explain the particularity of our emotional relationship with zombies. We hate them, but our behaviors, our fandom, the money we sink into them suggest that we also are at least attached to them, if not love them. So I'm going to just make a couple points about the zombie film and history, and then lay out a couple of examples from maybe the last 100 years to suggest the cultural and emotional work they've done, how certain themes are reworked over time and others have emerged. So the US has been fascinated by zombies since William Seabrook wrote The Magic Island in 1929. I'm just taking a break here. A sort of romance of empire located in Haiti that reinforced stereotypical binaries like civilization, wilderness, white, black, masculine, feminine, superior, inferior. I'll just show you a few of these slides. So this is an illustration, which gives you an idea. This was kind of tough to teach in my class, mixed race class. He had a life that went beyond the book. This is a Canadian prize-winning graphic artist who did a very involved graphic novel about him, or graphic bio, I guess. And at the afterlife in Disney, Welcome to Seabrook, zombies, welcome to Seabrook. Okay. The Seabrook zombie was so different from our image of zombies that we probably wouldn't recognize it. It was not a brain-eating horror train, but rather an innocent person emotionally and mentally enslaved to a master who put him or her to work. Okay. And there's a whole history of this that's very interesting, but I'll pass on that right now. Films like White Zombie, 1932, took up Seabrook's Haiti location, but twisted it, making the zombie an American, a beautiful white woman zombified by an obsessed would-be lover with the help of a mysterious European. The trope of nation as woman and fears of the other are pretty obvious here. In a few scenes, however, we also see zombified men forced to do repetitive backbreaking work in a primitive factory, a theme later taken up by a number of zombie movies of the 80s and 90s. And it almost always appears in some way in every zombie movie or TV series. These concerns seem intimately interrelated to imperial fantasies of domination, accompanied by an underlying fear of the dulling work involved in all that domination, and an offsetting of that fear and labor onto zombie slaves. The film was panned by critics, but adored by fans, okay, and later hailed as a classic. Critical takes on zombie movies, films, and books reached a zenith in the first 2 decades of this century, cooling off since somewhere around 2015, although now there's like 4 or 5 new books coming out this year. But the popular interest in zombies has never faltered. Along the way, the zombie has proven to be a powerful signifier. After about 1945, both the representation and significance of zombies shifted, no longer singular. They now, quote, come in an anonymous, overwhelming mass, end quote, that reveals concerns with global catastrophes such as the Holocaust. Survivors of global catastrophes seem to psychologists to suffer from a particular kind of border issue, quote, a widespread sense that life and death were out of phase with each other, no longer properly distinguishable. This is from Luckhurst. And this is a theme reflected in movies like Day of the Dead. Other events exacerbated this concern. Advances in medicine, for instance, supported a form of life that seemed to hover between life and death. Over time, the concept of the zombie horde condensed all the fears one might associate with conformist culture, fears of communism, brainwashing, of the impact popular culture had on people's minds. Let's see. This is an interesting contrast, right? The expression, the empire bites, has teeth. Because one popular reading calls on zombies as justly deserved by the Imperial West. With the rise of neoliberal globalization, the old association between zombies and labor, which we saw in White Zombie, becomes central as many films and TV series focus on zombies as slaves working dead-end jobs, pun intended. In season 5 of Z Nation, for instance, enslaved zombies are forced to harvest the very mineral that keeps them enslaved. This leads some scholar Luckhurst to suggest that Land of the Dead, 2005, is not horror, but a peculiar new form of social realism, a literalization of the capitalist logic of the expropriation of dead labor from living bodies. Over time, zombies get a lot faster and thus more dangerous, and the only way to live is to keep moving from one briefly safe space to another. Here's the slow zombies. This trope is played out in Colson Whitehead's novel, The Lyrical World Elegy, Zone 1, 2011, probably the only zombie novel to be a finalist for a National Book Critics Circle Award and a Pulitzer. Whitehead pulls together a number of important themes: labor, migrants, transients, commitment, failure to commit. He gives us examples of humans who might as well be zombies, humans who have chosen a zombie life of repetitive work, interrupted by moments of intense consumption. And that consumer, metaphor is also very prevalent in the movies and the TV series. It's not much of a stretch to believe in Whitehead's two species of zombie: zombies on what we might call a traditional model, or ravenous killers and brain eaters, but in partial homage to the zombie traditional critique of labor under capitalism. Whitehead's contribution is the intermediate Walking Dead, zombies who don't necessarily attack, but are consumed with repetitive workplace actions. So, for instance, stocking the same shelf over and over, or trying to load paper into a copier over and over again. Pursuit and escape are dramatized as well. The main character, a wannabe conformist nicknamed Mark Spitz, endures the fate of so many climate change immigrants as he repeatedly finds his safe spaces transformed into death zones. As Mark Spitz puts it, quote, "There was no other reality apart from this. Move on to the next human settlement until you find the final one, and that's where you die." In the surreal and ambiguous end, Spitz throws himself into a zombie horde, ostensibly making a break for the river, even while walking into a sea of zombies. One interpretation of this scene is that Spitz, who is all through the novel, he celebrates what he himself calls his unrivaled mediocrity and the advantages this adaptation conferred in a mediocre world. So one interpretation is that he's found his tribe. He's finally found the answer to his longing to be a mediocre cog in a machine rather than an ambitious go-getter. But Whitehead leaves us wondering. Throughout the novel, Spitz has been mocked for not being able to swim, which is code for being Black in the United States. Now, as he leaps into the sea of the dead, he thinks, you have to learn to swim sometime. Does this suggest a human trait, the ability to change and grow, or is it code for his capitulation to the unthinking aggressions of zombie-like culture of neoliberalism? I don't know. Whitehead wrote Zone 1 over 15 years ago, and the cultural messages surrounding the zombie metaphor have shifted significantly since that time. I could offer some examples from 2025, including the film 28 Years Later, available on Netflix. But I think I'm going to end with a teaching anecdote. I did want to say the 28 Days franchise is kind of interesting because it occurs over about 12 years. So the scariest thing about it is there's alpha zombies. There's an alpha zombie, right? And also that they're very, very fast. Yeah, I won't leave that up because it's too disgusting. But. Okay. So I think I'm just going to end with this teaching anecdote. So I teach at Georgetown University, and last semester I taught a seminar called Zombie Law, Literature, and Culture to a surprisingly large number of students for an 8 a.m. class. I chose the topic because I'd become interested in the use of zombie imagery in legal settings, and because I wanted to teach an area I didn't know very well and experiment with decentering the classroom. As we all work together to unpack the many ways zombies show up as convenient metaphorical vehicles for working out complex issues, the question we were repeatedly drawn to was not, what are zombies, what do zombies mean, or what will we do in a zombie apocalypse, but which actually is a question that I think it was NASA took up. You know, they used it as a metaphor, basically, what are we going to do if there's a global catastrophe? But the question was, what does it mean to be human? Right? Initially, students thought of zombies as something out there. They were inhuman because they had no emotions, and the biggest thing they said was emotions at first. And no free will, could kill and eat humans without remorse, responded to stimuli unthinkingly, lacked a moral compass, etc. So twice a week for 75 minutes, we talked about nothing but zombies and zombie metaphors. To offer a final example of the overdetermined nature of the zombie symbol, and again, Adam Phillips says, hang on. As Adam Phillips says, symptoms do all the work they can, right? Students presented research on zombies and labor law, zombies and inequality, zombies and racism, zombies and consumerism, zombie laws, zombie corporations, zombie Marxism, zombies and mass culture, embodied continuity as a condition for imagining the self. That was one of my favorites. Zombies and work, zombies and terrorism, and zombies, borders, and the representation of immigrant hordes, right? This was really intellectualized, but over the course of the semester, the zombie metaphor became far more relevant and compelling than I had anticipated. It spoke to my students. About 9 weeks into the semester, one of the brightest students in the class uncharacteristically raised his voice and spoke out of turn. Listen, everyone, there are no zombies. Zombies are not real. They aren't real now, and they will never be real. We might die from a pandemic, but we will never suffer a zombie apocalypse. So it seemed that they had slipped from studying zombies as representations of various cultural forces to imagining them as sort of part of their own psyche or self-identity, while simultaneously fearing and being disgusted by them. So I have to note, in a recent survey that has all the authority of the internet, 46% of people in the US said they believe that zombie apocalypse is possible. Okay. I did sense some slippage for the students. I heard students say they've been living like zombies, stumbling through their days without thought, following the crowd or the swarm, as zombie scholars say, unthinkingly consuming or preparing themselves for the sort of consumption that accompanies upper middle class life in the US. In another iteration, they were pursued by zombies who harrowed them from task to task, forcing them to keep moving or die. Now, for last week, I reviewed the reflective essays that they wrote at the end of the semester, and I'm channeling Adam Phillips here and wondering if there's an unacknowledged, forbidden something my students and maybe a population of zombie fans are seeking. Could it be permission to reject the life that's been dealt them? A life of unrelenting pressure to be everything to everyone. This is Georgetown. So they have to be smart, well-dressed, attractive, hardworking, and always, always upwardly mobile and never show stress. That's the culture. It is often said that our students face choice fatigue. They agonize over every choice, feeling that the wrong choice will destroy their lives. Yet they are also well aware of how privileged they are, and they feel tremendously guilty if they express any distress. Perhaps the fascination with zombies was about wanting something zombies have that they don't have, an imposed, singular focus or purpose that leaves no room for shame or guilt, right? No matter how disgusting. So as humans, we are ambivalent creatures. Zombies appear as uninhibited desire, while human desires are replete with contradictory impulses. Like the mother who laughs from one side of her face and cries from the other, our attachments are never single-minded. This ability to inhabit or maybe tolerate opposing mindsets is, my students finally decided, what it means to be human. Well, thank you. Thank you. All right.
Thank you very much, Catherine. We're all wondering if we're zombies now. Our second paper is given by Hannah Wickman from the University of Rostock, and she is speaking to us at the border of belonging, domestic slavery in late medieval Florence.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for the kind introduction, Claire. I would like to start my paper with a little note, which was delivered together with a baby boy given to one of Flowen's foundling hospitals in 1405. And I quote, "In the name of God, 17th of November, 1405. This child is the son of Graziano di Bernaba della Scarperia, who got him upon Caterina, slave of Giovanni Orlandi, in February 1404. The said child was born on 16th of November at 1 o'clock in the morning. He has not been baptized. Take care of him because the said Graziano, out of shame, will have him taken away and given to other people. Nevertheless, do as you see fit and as you usually do with others." Notes similar to this one exist in hundreds in the registers of the foundling hospitals, where unwanted children could be given away without any direct economic or social consequences for the families of origin. We often get information regarding the date of birth, the parents, or things which were handed in together with the children, like linen or clothes. But the part I'm interested in lies in the statement that Graziano, so the father of the child, seemingly felt vergogna, shame, upon fathering an illegitimate child with the enslaved woman Caterina, and therefore decided to give their son away. And after the talk of Gary today, I asked myself if I have to maybe change here the word of shame again to embarrassment maybe, but I decided to let it stand like that because of also like the social implement of the word shame. So, but maybe we can discuss that later. So, little Frediano is later on baptized by the caretakers of the Ospedale, but his fate vanishes in the silence of the archive, like that of many other children fathered by Florentine men on female slaves like Caterina. So, how to bring their, as well as their mothers' lives out of this archival silence? The field of research on slavery in medieval times is expanding rapidly, and a vast amount of research on this topic is now available. For late medieval Italy and the Mediterranean Sea, the monographs of Stephen Epstein, Hannah Barker, and Juliane Schiel are groundbreaking, while now also a second generation of scholars is advancing on this topic, including Angela Zhang and Corinna Perez, whose PhD publications will be available soon, at least as far as I know. I'm myself not a historian who's specializing in the history of slavery, as I'm rather interested in the intergenerational communication between family members, and therefore more invested in the so-called family books and ricordanze of the Florentines. Nevertheless, these sources provide a refreshing and more intimate insight into the households in which these enslaved women lived and worked, and could therefore function as an addition to the research on late medieval slavery. My paper will thus examine the written and visual depiction of female slaves in the Florentine family records, and in a second step, I try to assess the usage of emotions and emotional language the authors used to create and describe these women and their children as foreign, strange, different, and therefore as an other. So, the most frequent form in which female slaves are mentioned in the ricordanze can be explained by the original function of these texts, which primarily recorded property, income, and expenditure. Originating from the account books of the Florentine merchant class, the ricordanze contain not only the economic aspects, but also private notifications like information regarding the birth and death of close family members, marriage, or the baptizing of children. The function of these books was the remembrance of certain family-related aspects, which the author deemed important enough to pass on to his, most times, male heir. Thus, it is a pragmatic, transgenerational form of writing, which at best has been preserved and continued over several generations. In those texts, slaves are repeatedly mentioned as property or investments, and thus as an in- or outcome-generating component of the family assets. Therefore, we find them mostly linked to the economic parts of these books. In the case of the Ricordanze Segrete, so the secret memories, by Niccolo de Baldurinetti, who wrote his records in the second half of the 13th century, we find the economic aspect of the acquisition of enslaved women very clearly. He describes how he bought 3 enslaved women over a total period of 12 years. The first slave mentioned in his records is Tiratea, whom he bought in 1376. And maybe I should also add that the translations are my own. And so I think there are also like Italian-speaking people here. You can also like add maybe a little bit later if there are some improvements done. So I quote, remembrance that on 2nd of May of the aforementioned year, I bought a slave from Bartolomeo d'Arigo from Venice for 35 florin. This slave wore the name Tiratea, therefore Dorothea, a Tatar from Russia. She is young, about 18 years or less. I paid 25 florin to the commune, and it cost me 4 florin to provide her clothes, for she was nearly without them, which in total made 40 gold florin. The entry has the function of commemorating a financial transaction and of indicating a legal claim to the person acquired. The reader learns the original price of the enslaved person, the name of the seller, and any additional costs he had to pay in the form of administrative payment, clothing, and so on. At the same time, however, her original name was also changed and adapted into Italian from Tiratea to Dorothea, a practice frequently used for women originating from the Eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea regions to disguise their origins. Furthermore, the woman is also marked as being of infidel origin, as she's designated as a Tatar from Russia, but we may assume that Baldovinetti doesn't properly distinguish between a Russian and a Tatarian ethnicity, as normally these 2 markers would mean different geographical origins, but I will later come back to this topic. As you surely already notice, Baldovinetti also adds a visual marking to his entry, which seems to be one of the first illustrations of slaves in the context of family-related communication, as well as in Florence in general. He draws the profile of Tiratea in the margins of his text by his own hand. Amateur doodles and other forms of marginalia are widely known and recognized in medieval scripts. Other examples presented by, for example, Michel Camille, Johann Krehm, or Susanne Wittekind seem to be more stylized, while I argue that in this case, Baldovinetti at least attempted to make a more or less naturalistic depiction of Tiratea, and I hope this becomes clearer as soon as I present the other 2 examples. Tiratea remains only for a short time in the Baldovinetti household, for it's around 3 years later. I sold the slave on 2nd of September, 1379 to a peasant for 36 florin. There are no further entries which might tell us anything about the circumstances of Tiratea's life, but the need for a slave in the Baldovinetti household was obviously still there later on, because after selling her, he acquires the next slave only 1 year later. And I quote again, remembrance that on 29th of November of the aforementioned year, I bought a slave for 45 florin, and her name is Domenica. She is of white skin and of Tataric provenance. Again, the marking as Tatar becomes apparent despite being characterized as white. Stephen Epstein and Hannah Barker presume a higher price for white-skinned slaves. Therefore, the explicit wording in Baldovinetti's Ricordanze might suggest that he also attributed importance to this aspect. In addition, we also find a doodle of the woman. Domenica seemed to possess rounder features. The chin is highlighted by drawing a double pen stroke, and she too wears a headdress. This headdress aligns with the sumptuary laws of Florence, which decreed that all slaves, nurses, and maids born outside of the territory of the city must be dressed with a little cape of black cloth. The 3rd and last slave to appear in Baldovinetti's Ricordanze is Veronica, whom he bought in 1388 and whose entry is visually noticeable not only because of the marginalia, but also because of the eye-catching headline the author put above the entry titled Veronica Schiava, so Veronica the slave. I quote again, remembrance that on 18th of November of the said year, I bought from Simone di Bonarotta a slave for 60 gold florin from Bosnia, therefore Tartara. This slave wore the name Stronica. She was renamed Veronica and was young, about 16 years old. I bought her nearly nude. Veronica, or Stronica, was acquired for a much higher price than Tiratea and Domenica. It seems likely that she previously lived as a slave in the Bonarotta household, a well-known Florentine family, not just because of their famous later offspring Michelangelo. Stronica is, of course, described as foreign. Interestingly, Baldovinetti again seems to mix two different ethnic and geographical markers in this case. He describes her as a person from Bosana, so most likely Bosnia, but then adds that she's a Tartarian, which doesn't add up if she indeed originates from the Balkan. So either Baldovinetti himself does not know exactly where she originally came from, or he does not care, or again, he adds the ethnic description of Tatara to purely justify the enslaved status of the woman, because in his mind, a Tatar is always infidel, and therefore the enslavement of Stronica is legally justified. The drawing of her is also distinctive. Compared to the doodle of Tiratea, for example, Baldovinetti seems to add more detail to this one. She is drawn with a straight nose and seems to have a scar on her neck. So this one you see here. So how could these visual depictions be interpreted? I would like to argue that first and foremost, this practice underlines his legal claim on these women as his property, like he does, for example, with real estate, whereas he also draws little depictions of the places he bought. Furthermore, it works as a form of securing said legal claim for his family. Therefore, the ethnic marking as Tatar is used as a legal justification to prove the slave's infidel ancestry and to pass that information on to his heirs in case of his death. In doing so, he marked these women as foreign, different, and therefore as an other in Florentine society. So, how to integrate methods of the history of emotion into the source material? The first aspect which comes in mind regarding these family-related records is in fact the lack of emotional communication these sources provide, especially regarding the enslaved persons. Here again, we have a form of archival silence in which these women and their emotions are either erased or purposely left out of family-related communication. Nevertheless, there are tidbits of possibilities to study. And here again, I have to say sorry, because I'm using a little bit of the Barbara Rosenwein's emotional communities, but I hear that now it's a little bit in conflict with neo-research. So, but as a medievalist, it's still a bit interesting. So yeah, I will just add that. So first is the usage of Barbara Rosenwein's emotional communities, in which she states that the same social groups know how to code and decode emotions and emotional language. So if you're part of, for example, the Florentine elite, you know what a person meant when he or she states that he is feeling melancholic. But I would like to argue that the enslaved women are not part of that social and emotional community, as their emotions may be coded and communicated differently, which means they are not only looking different, acting different, and speaking different, but are also feeling different. Whether their emotions could be decoded by Florentines should be also looked at in sources outside or additional to the Ricordanze. But for these family records, it seems nearly impossible to look at the emotions of the enslaved women from a historical point of view. Or maybe you have also ideas which we can discuss later. So one exception, though, is the written depiction of the liberation of these women. In 1460, Marco Parenti buys an enslaved woman named Nastasia and notes, so just as Baldovinetti did, this transaction in his family record. Nastasia then repeatedly appears in these records in the following years, mostly connected to her being the wet nurse to some of his legitimate children. Among others, she served as the wet nurse of Piero, who after his father's death inherits the family fortune, as well as the records of Marco Parenti. So Piero Parenti notes later on in these records, and I quote, "I recall that on Christmas morning, which was on December 25, 1493, I freed my slave Nastasia, which was bought as it appears in this book's page 52. And on January 12 of that year, I gave her a document signed by Messer Agnolo di Alessandro da Casasso, a Florentine notary." Although not directly insinuated by Piero himself, one may interpret that here we see the liberation of Nastasia due to a possible emotional connection he developed regarding his former wet nurse. Ignoring the transactional tone of this entry and the possibility that he freed her for his soul's salvation, which indicates the date of the liberation, it shows nevertheless that at least some of the authors were invested in the well-being of these women, as later he notes the further development of Nastasia's life. One group which is much more documented in the Florentine Ricordanze are the illegitimate children the patriarchs fathered on their female slaves. Many of the children were handed over to one of the city's foundling hospitals, like we saw in the example of Frediano, or given to foster parents who looked after the unwanted offspring outside the city. A look into the Ricordanze, though, provides an additional information and again a kind of corrective to some historians who impute that the vast majority of children fathered on female slaves were abandoned and therefore not emotionally cared for. In fact, many children grew up in their families' households, one of which I want to present before finishing my paper. So take, for instance, Matteo, who was most likely fathered by Bana Ciuriani with the slave Bartolomea. The legitimate heir of Bana, Valorino, writes after the death of his father, 1380, in his Ricordanze. Additionally, there remained of him, although it was not certain, and therefore in his life he did not recognize him, a bastard boy aged 3 years and some months, son of Bartolomea, the slave who had been ours. His name is Matteo, and for the love of God and for his soul, I recognized him. So Valorino seems kind of certain that Matteo is his illegitimate half-brother, as he shows responsibility for the boy by bringing him into his household shortly after his father's death. There, Matteo remained until his death from the plague in 1400. The fact that from then on, Valorino always refers to him with the diminutive form Ciuffetto is more evidence that Matteo was integrated into his brother's household, regardless of the fact that he was the son of a slave. And I quote again, "And Matteo died, who was called Ciuffetto, and he was the son of one of our slaves, and for the love of God and for the soul of Bana, my father, I took him back from the wet nurse and kept him for 20 years. I buried him at the said church, but outside. God forgive him." Like other children mentioned in the family books, Matteo was part of the family into which he had been born through his father. Although his father himself never claimed him as his own, someone in the family organized that he was given to a wet nurse, while later on he was cared for by his brother. The Florentine family records show many examples of children by female slaves that were integrated into their fathers' families. Comparatively prominent examples are Ginevra, the daughter fathered by the famous Francesco d'Attini with his slave, or Carlo de' Medici, who later embarked on a successful clerical career and was fathered by Cosimo de' Medici with the slave Maddalena. These children are inscribed in the family community of solidarity by the texts. Strikingly, the enslaved mothers are generally not mentioned further. However, the illegitimate children themselves are not concealed, but in some cases even brought close to the legitimate children. The price for this, however, was suppression of the mothers, whose further fate is no longer reported, or at least not reported in the family records. And I come to my conclusion. In the Florentine family books and Ricordanze, the enslaved women appear in the margins of the written and visual records, both literally and figuratively. This absence, however, is not neutral. It is an emotional and cultural strategy that constructs otherness through omission, classification, and control. Their foreignness becomes not only an administrative label, but a moral and emotional boundary separating belonging from exclusion. The apparent lack of emotional expression towards enslaved women is itself an effective stance, reflecting indifference, domination, and emotional distancing as instruments of control. Yet, in the rare glimpses where emotion surfaces, such as the liberation of Nastasia or the affection implied in the story of Ciuffetto, we see that feelings too structured these relationships. Compassion, shame, or pious concern emerge within the rigid frameworks of property and patriarchy. Thus, emotions in these texts do not simply express human sentiment, they perform social boundaries. The oscillation between tenderness and erasure, between affective inclusion and exclusion, mirrors the ambivalence of Florentine society itself, a society that defined its moral and familiar order by positioning the enslaved woman as the other, for they did not belong, had no social connections, and could not fall back on a kinship network that was so important in the world of the Italian communes. This otherness, in the social sense, was primarily responsible for the more than precarious living conditions of the female slaves. Ultimately, studying these traces allow us to recognize that otherness in the Florentine Ricordanze was not only a matter of ethnicity or legal status, but also an emotional construction, one that defines who could feel and whose feelings were allowed to matter. And like shown in our first example, it is Graziano whose emotion, so shame, is communicated and therefore allowed to matter, while Caterina's feelings remain unknown. Thank you very much for your attention. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Hannah. So while everything is being set up, I will introduce our third speaker, Pilar Osorio from UNICA in Colombia, not in Mexico, as it says in the program. And I do not speak Spanish, so I will let you give the title of your paper,
Okay.
Pilar.
I have to, well, first of all, thanks for being here. And it is an honor for me to be in this university because two of the women that I admire the most had taught in this university, Rosario Castellanos and Julieta Ferro. And given that we are so near to Death's Day, I felt like I should honor them because they were like fantastic women. My paper is written in Spanish. This book is written in patois, and I'll be speaking in English. So I'll ask for a little bit of compassion with my brain. I'll do my best to do it, to deliver all this paper in English, but it might be jumping between languages. So first of all, I want to clarify that I come from literature studies and cultural studies. So I'll give you a couple of key elements to understand my presentation. This book, Bang by Michelle Cliff, is about Jamaica in the 50s. Jamaica was independent in the 60s. So, and the name refers to the conch that the slaves used, first of all, by the colonizers to be called, but then they like gave a new significance, a new meaning to this conch, and they used it to call into the rebellion and to call like to the Maroons, know where they were. This is a little summary of the book, so we can be all in the same page of what is this about. The main character is Claire Savage, who is a mixed Jamaican girl, and she, in the society that she grows up, is one that privileges whiteness as what is ideal and what is supposed to be proud of, while being Black is a cause of shame, and you should hide your Blackness. She's really close to her father at the beginning of the book, but then there's a turning point. Persuades her best friend Zoe to go and like into a hunting of a wild pig that is supposed to prove courage among the Maroons. But when they're going to do this, Zoe, who is the worker's daughter, says like, oh, I can't do this because it's too dangerous for me. You can go back to Kingston, and I have to stay here in St. Elizabeth, that is like the countryside. So in that moment, they decide to change plans in their hunting, and they go into the river and get naked. And there's a worker passing by, and he begins like to tease and bully these girls. And Claire takes a gun and shot. She isn't able to kill the guy, but she kills a bull that is really important for her grandmother. And because of that, her father decides to take her into a woman's house called Mrs. Phillips, and but also is the first time that he calls her black. He has always been calling her white, although she is a mulatto girl. So this is basically the story. Please, if I'm going too fast or if my English is chunky, let me know. Thanks. So the book has a stylistic feature that I love, and that is that the narrator is always telling us this character does not know that, and then the narrator gives us a historical explanation. For example, no one had told the people of the tabernacle that all the slave societies in the New World, Jamaica was considered among the most brutal. And this is the repeated structure of the book. So we know the narrator knows more than the characters, and that is going to be key for my final statement about this book. So as I know many of you don't come from the literature studies field, I'm going to clarify a couple of terms. First, I'm going to read the book from Dottie Sommer perspective, who says that there are certain books that you can read as a metaphor of the national search for identities. All the books that she analyzes, and like in a really nice and harmonic identity where Black and white people become together and they live happily forever. But my interpretation is that during the 20th century, there are a lot of books that state that this isn't true, that that fantasy of the mixture is never like really materialized. The second term that I'm going to use is Bildungsroman, that is the coming of age, that traditionally is this boy, this teenage, who travels the world and comes back home. And in that travel, he discovers how his parents are like right about how the world works, and they decide to continue that structure. Well, when I began my PhD many years ago, I was wondering what happened with characters that never leave the house. Like, do they never mature, or how do they mature? And of course, the first thing that I noticed was that women are the main characters, because we don't tend to leave the home and like travel alone. So what I state is that this book is a Bildungsroman made possible by like an emotional travel, because Claire travels her emotions, and that's how she arrives into her maturity. And third term that is really important for me is the biopolitics of childhood by Eduardo Bustillo, who states that children are super aware of their weaknesses and vulnerability, and sometimes they tend to satisfy adults' needs and expectations for not being like die of hunger and like no home, like, you know, like the basics biology. So what Bustillo states is that sometimes when children do not satisfy our expectations, we take away their ability, their right to be children, and we begin to treat them as adults just because they, for example, get a gun and shot a bull. What happened with Claire, that she is like expelled from innocence because of this act. This morning we had a really fascinating speech by Dr. Parrott about shame and guilt, but I'm going to condense this super big theory in two terms. When I talk about pride, I am talking about revealing and showing. And when I'm talking about shame, I'm going to be about hiding and like going inward and not wanting to be seen. So Claire has two emotional inheritances. First, her father, that is Boy Savage. He's super proud about his colonial privileges, and he's systematically denying his origins of being Black. Actually, he thinks about himself as white, but the narrator is always telling us he's Black. And there are two moments where Claire confronts her father. First, when she's reading Anne Frank, she doesn't understand why everyone was seeing that and what happened with the Jews, and no one said nothing. So she's like, why that? Why did this happen? And then boy answers like, oh, you know, Jews were put in earth just so we can become better persons by tolerating them, and something like that. He's a really complicated guy. And at some point, she asked if a half Jew is also a Jew. And he says like, of course, a Jew is always a Jew. And then she's able to translate their experience into herself and said like, oh, well, if mom is black and you are white, I'm a black. And in that moment, he is the first time that he is like, no, you can't think about it. And he denies the right to think to her daughter. And the second point, situation where we see how boy expels Claire from this idea of childhood is when she kills the old bull, and he calls her black. And she calls her black because she has taken a gun. She has this is what it said. She has like not followed the rules of the home, and that moral deviation is associated with blackness. So from that moment on, he's going to treat her as black. So this is one of the emotional inheritance she has. And the other one is the one by her mother, who is Kitty Freeman. She is super proud about being black, and but she's silent all over the book. The first scene we see her is when there's a funeral procession from Black people, and Claire asks, what are they singing? And when Kitty wants to answer, boy answers before her and says like, oh, nothing, those weird things from Africa, we don't need them. And Kitty stays silent. But the second moment that is really interesting is when they're gonna send her to live with Mrs. Phillips. Kitty explains to her that white people are really complicated and that Mrs. Freeman is just like a little bit like her father, but that it is necessary to understand how the white people work and to be able to know when to talk and when to be silent, so you can like survive and make your silences have a little bit of a last name. So your silence is not like, I have nothing to say. It's more like, you are not allowing me to say what I think. And this is like the biggest teaching of Kitty Freeman to her daughter. And yeah, I'm thinking about Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, about this idea of if you leave a silence just without a last name, the other one could misinterpret it, and you need to add something. And that is what we're going to see in the narrator, stylist, in the narrator, that is always saying like, she doesn't know that. In that last name is where I see Claire as an adult writing the book, because she wants to acknowledge the ignorance, but also the content of the ignorance. Then we have two big characters with whom Claire is able like to enact those legacies. So the first one is when there's a beautiful scene when they're reading news about girls feeling like boys and wanting to marry each other. And it's a sickness, really weird, happening in Peru. And Zoe is really scared because she says like, if that happens to me, I will be expelled from St. Elizabeth. And Claire, who's super entitled, and she's like shameless, and of course this white privilege she has inherited from her dad, she says like, oh, don't worry, I'll act as a man completely so we can marry each other, which is beautiful. But of course, Zoe is like, no, I wouldn't be able to do that, because she's aware of her lack of privilege. And the other part, the other scene that is fascinating is the one on the hunting that I told you about. And in that scene is fantastic how they're talking in patois, but when, and so it says like, you have a lot of privilege, and so it says like, and Claire says like, no, I don't have it. But then when the worker appears, Claire, without knowing and without noticing, she changes into a bukra, that is the Jamaican way to say like formal English. So she's switching codes systematically and using privilege in a fantastic way. She's aware that the margin and the limit is her biggest privilege, and she uses it. And of course, so it becomes like an ethical mirror of Claire's privilege. And the other character that is super important for enacting the emotional legacy of Claire is Mrs. Phillips. She is the one who's like teaching the colonial approach to feelings or the colonial emotions. First of all, she's one of the first nights, she is telling about Miss Beatrice, who was a too ambitious woman who used to read just as Claire with Anne Frank and Charles Dickens, and she's like a really good reader. And Mrs. Phillip explains to Claire that reading a lot is too ambitious for a woman, and that is not a good idea, that must be forbidden and like punished. And then there's a beautiful moment when this Miss Beatrice, who's Mrs. Phillips' sister, she tells the story about Miss Beatrice having had a children with a Black man. And the final sentence, one of the final sentences of the book, is that mixture only produces sadness. So it's the idea that that is not a good idea and that everyone should stay in their border side. And in that moment, from that moment on, Claire won't talk anymore. She will be always silent, as her mother taught her. But her silence is fascinating because at the beginning of the book, when Boy expels her from the idea of innocence and childhood, she's going to be ashamed. But then this silence is going to be like with the chest open and like a little bit of rebellious. And we're going to see in that moment of her shoulders, we're going to see the last name of that silence. Like, I'm here, just see me. I'm not going to change. I'm not going to talk to you because I know you won't be able to understand and you're going to try to silence me, but I'm not going to disappear. I'm here. So I think that's beautiful. And at the end, what the book invites us to think, or well, my interpretation of the book is that to mature in this book is to inhabit the limit and to be there. And she gets what Ansaldúa will call the mestiza consciousness. And it comes from an emotional literacy that she does by exploring her own emotions and reading the emotions in the people that surround her. In her awakening, we at the beginning see only shame, then silence, but in the narrator's voice, we see pride because she's excessive in the historical data that she offers us. So the narrator is really like bluffing about everything she knows about history, Jamaican history and African history. So in the sense, the novel refuses to the logic of a national recovery, and there's no return to innocence. Like there's no way to be like happily ever after. There's no harmony, but in that sense, maturity becomes the idea of giving up the adult fantasy of innocence. And that's all. I think I run a lot of it.
Thank you very much, Pilar. Are there any questions for our panel? Yes? No, we have a microphone coming.
Thank you so much. All those talks were fascinating. My question is for Hannah. In, I think, the third example you gave in the description, in the entry about purchasing the slave woman, the last line says, "I bought her nearly nude." That kind of just jumped out to me with a lot, especially with the things you were talking about, you know, children out, you know, between these relationships, and it just jumped out to me. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Do you have any interpretation? Why did he include that? Why, I mean, is that unusual and that's why he put it? Or is there something sexualized going on there?
Thank you for the question. I think it is not really unusual that they add that because they are interested in these economic aspects. Well, firstly, interested in the economic aspects, and that's why he always adds that he had to buy clothes for the slaves. So that's why they always write down, okay, they are nude or nearly nude when we got them. But these sexualized aspects you talked about is, of course, also there, right? Because there are a lot of, like the babies show, there are a lot of examples of women who got pregnant from these family patriarchs in Florence. And a thing I haven't talked a lot about, but is also like a, but there has been a lot of research done about by Christiane Klapisch-Zuwer, is the wet nurses, that the slaves also like worked in a case as wet nurses. And of course, if you work as a wet nurse, you also have to get pregnant, right? So yeah, that's also the case that they rented these women out to other families and also got the money for themselves then. And yeah, of course, that's also like a big thing that is happening. But I would say in that example of, I think it was the example of Veronica, it's not really unusual that he adds this in case that he is really like sexually interested in Veronica as, especially. I would say it's more like an economic aspects also because he had to buy clothes. Yeah.
Anyone else? Another question? Giovanni?
Not a real question, just a comment. Of course, I was very interested in all your presentation, but in the Florentine case, because I was thinking that the first Duke of Florence was the son of an enslaved woman, Simonetta da Colevecchio, Alessandro il Moro, Alessandro Moorish. It's very an interesting case, which is, of course, a later example of a different a sense of private, of being proud of being the son of that lady, but publicly no. So you have different portrait of Alessandro Moro, and the portraits that were addressed to a family audience where you could see his blackness, and the portraits they were actually addressed to the public, where the blackness is not obvious anymore. So that is a quite interesting case. And he was also the father of a girl, a little girl, Julia. And there was a portrait, the only portrait of Julia. And you can see the Afro-descendant traits was completely erased from the portraits. And only in the 1913, if I'm right in my recollection, the portraits came out again. That is another interesting case because even her daughter, her status was never denied, but her blackness had to be hidden. And that is something that comes out in different stories of domestic slaves in Florence. Now there is an entire, actually, lots of research is carrying out what is called the hidden Renaissance. And so lots of research on the visual representations of slaves in Florence. They are there. And you show actually that you could find also visual representation of slaves, but not much research has been done so far. So I'm glad that you are working on that. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question? Oh, did you want to say something?
No, just a little comment. Yeah, thank you for the comment because the portrait of Carlo de' Medici I showed, there are also, I think, some art historians who argue that you also see like, well, not blackness, but that the Maddalena, his mother, was a Circassian woman. And I don't know if you noticed, but he has like really bluish eyes. And there's also like sometimes the interpretation that that also comes from this Caucasian region. But yeah, also like you said that you could also like adapt, right, in these portraits. And so yeah, we never know what was changed later on. And yeah, but with this example of Carlo de' Medici, also we see a little bit of that. And yeah, that example of Alessandro is also really really good example. But I'm finishing at like 1500 with the Ricordanza, because like I'm sure you know that afterwards it's exploding in the literature of that type. So yeah, but thank you for the comment.
Another question from anyone? Katie.
Thanks. They were all lovely papers, and I'm struggling to really articulate my question here, but I'm going to have a go. And it's really for Catherine and Pilar. And thinking about representation and then thinking about emotional cultures, maybe Charles used that term earlier. And I was kind of wondering about what seemed to be similar in both your papers was we have an emotional experience that is kind of being deployed to create a culture, a sort of norm, an emotional community. But I think that's the wrong word. I think it is emotional culture. It's a sense of which you could say it's creating a discourse that might have been a more, an older way of exploring what is going on here. But I'm kind of interested in the way that the emotion isn't just something people have and do in the text that maybe have particular kinds of effects, but it's actually trying to create a sort of a community around a particular emotional experience. And I'm wondering if you had any comment on why that's happening or how that happens in these texts, in the sense that you create something, emotions. It's a bit like the sort of thing we say there's an age of anxiety in the modern. And I think that sense of ambivalence has that similar idea, right? That we're trying to creating a normative, a community of people who are shaped around having a particular feeling, right? And we use these texts to support that. And similarly with shame, we're kind of using this kind of normative idea of shame to create something bigger where an emotion becomes a kind of macro norm that shapes a culture. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that idea.
Well, I think I said to you during the break that this work either had to be a book or a footnote. I'm not sure which. But as a book, I think I would have to look at like reviews and chat, lines on the internet and stuff like that, because it's really a pop culture sort of niche community that loves these movies. And the other part that isn't here is, there's just a tremendous amount of research on horror and why people like horror, and I haven't done that research. That doesn't maybe answer your question, but I think, in the class, we formed a community around it. Some of the students came because they wanted to have a course that had something to do with law. Some came because they liked the idea of zombies. They had many different reasons for coming to the class, but by the end, we had a common conversation, and common concerns, enough that one student burst out with his worry that we were taking this all too literally. So, I think communities can be formed around particular emotions. Sometimes they occur naturally because of some kind of outside force. And one thing that's happening with these movies is they're almost predictive. And I think that I might not have put this quotation, I'm not sure I can get it right, but Ursula Le Guin said, science fiction is not predictive, it's descriptive, right? And when I think of Zone 1, it seems very descriptive, right? And easy at least for US citizens to identify with at this point. So yeah, thanks for that, Katie.
I guess in this book and in many books in Latin America that are about like times before big changes, social changes, what they state is that, for example, in Event, at the beginning, being Black is just shame and being white is just pride. But while the character develops, we can see that she feels pride and shame about the same subject. For example, her father's family used to have like a big plantation of sugar, of cane, and he's really proud about it. But when she arrives there, she's able to see like the big mansion and the big house, but she's also able to see the cabins of the slaves. So she feels pride and shame at the same time. And that also happens with her mother. So at the beginning, it's only shame because of the poorness related to Blackness. But when she sees the way her mother navigates like vulnerability, she feels pride and shame on that situation. So the emotional community becomes more and more complex. And that's like my insignificant fight with Dirty Summer that says like there's a final reconciliation, and I don't think so. I think it's like a community that is emotionally way more complicated when we try to be just one community.
Any other questions? I think everybody is going to sleep now because it's been such a long day. Susan.
Just a quick question for Catherine. I haven't watched that many zombie movies, but I watched The Last of Us for several episodes. And one thing that struck me was that, are people ambivalent about the zombies, or are they embracing the fantasy of self-reliance and, living apart from society and using their ingenuity? Is that going on as well? Because Americans love that mythology, which isn't possible, but nevertheless they celebrate.
Well, I don't know about my particular students, but I think that is part of the enjoyment, right? I think the other part is a lot of the films and the TV series. I mean, I haven't seen all that many, maybe 10 films and 3 series, but you have the camaraderie of a small group of people that come together, right? And I think that's very appealing to people. Yeah. I think, for years I've been interested in mixed emotions, right? And when we talk about emotions so often, we try to narrow it down to 1 or 2, like I did for this paper. But there's a whole cluster of emotions around these kinds of films. Yeah.
All for questions. Okay, well, I'd like to thank our 3 speakers for 3 fantastic papers. And I think we can all switch off for the day and think about dinner. But thank you very much.